do that, let's have a word of prayer together. I realize I've got the PowerPoint, but I don't have my clicker, so. Ray, would you open this in a word of prayer while I say that?
Let's pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we just praise and thank you for this time together. And honor and praise unto you and your word. See what you have for us. The word that we can hide in our hearts, that we can use this with to do our own freedom. All those that we might come in contact with, prepare their hearts and we might be able to share the message of the Lord Jesus Christ. And how it's something in life and looking forward to it. Your pastor is a pleasing message. For this we pray. In the name of our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen. I did want to start a new section of Job on a Sunday evening. Otherwise, next Sunday morning, people are going to be a little bit confused as we drop into the middle of one of Job's replies. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. I have a question for you. How would you describe the life of Joseph? How would you describe the life of Joseph? Up and down. Up and down. The illustration that I use is that of a roller coaster, right? Even if you've never been on one, you've probably seen one. 90% of what a roller coaster is you get strapped into a big metal box and you go up and down, right? So there's high points and there's low points. And that's certainly the life of Joseph. We're going to be looking at, in a single chapter, going from low to high in different ways at different times in his life. If you look quickly back at chapter 37, we sort of see where his story begins. Chapter 37, verse 1, it says, "And Jacob dwelled in the land wherein his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob, Joseph being 17 years old." And so Joseph's story really begins when he's about 17 years old. For him, it's very much a time of immaturity during those years. Let's be honest, 17, those were years of immaturity for all of us, right? But we see him doing things like tattling on his brothers. See that at the end of verse 2 of chapter 37. Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. He brags to his brothers about dreams that he has that would seem to indicate that one day they're going to be serving him. Jacob certainly didn't make anything better by playing favorites, did he? And so Joseph, early in his life, is on top of the world. He's on the high point of the roller coaster. I'll stay over here. Shortly after that 17th year of his life, he has that first time of defeat. He's sold into slavery by his brothers, who then lie to their father about what actually takes place there. You know the story, the coat of many colors. It's torn from him, soaked in lamb's blood, and taken back to their father as proof of Joseph's death, even though it's all a lie. And so the first years of his life are a period of, it's a high point, followed shortly by a time of defeat as he's sold into slavery by his brothers. In chapter 39, where we're going to be spending our time this evening, we see the roller coaster start ticking back up again. We see a time of victory in Joseph's life in the first 6 verses. While he has been sold into slavery, in verse 1, when we see it says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian." That's Potiphar. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him the overseer in his house, and all that he had. And the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he knew not what he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. And so, going from what Joseph sees as the lowest point in his life, Joseph now, the hill starts climbing again. He's going back up, and he sees a time of victory. And it all surrounds an individual, really, by the name of Potiphar. He purchased Joseph from the band of Ishmaelites to whom he was sold by his brothers. Probably didn't know who he was getting, just thought, you know what, maybe I need another household slave. And so he purchases this young man who seems to be in good condition. But his purchase of Joseph becomes a turning point. It really is the hinge upon which this period of victory, this time of victory in Joseph's life, swings. Because Potiphar, even though he thought maybe he was just getting yet another slave for his house, what he really received in Joseph was someone upon whom the Lord had his hand. The Lord was consistently with Joseph. In fact, that becomes the key phrase of chapter 39. The Lord was with Joseph. In verse 2, it just says it outright. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. So 4 times in this chapter we see that the Lord is with Joseph. My question then becomes, if that's the key understanding, the key phrase of this chapter, what does it mean, really, that the Lord was with Joseph? I mean, isn't God omnipresent? Isn't God everywhere present at all times, in all places? Yeah. So what does it mean that the Lord was with him? How is that even a big deal? Because isn't God everywhere anyway? What does it mean that the Lord was with Joseph specifically? 2 things. It's a reference to God's active presence and participation in Joseph's life. God's active presence and participation in Joseph's life. And so, while yes, we say that God is omnipresent, he is everywhere, it's not that he is just standing back and watching and doing nothing. And specifically, as we're examining the life of Joseph here, we see that God is very active in Joseph's life. Joseph, I mean, it's not like Joseph orchestrated these events so that he knew that he would get sold to Potiphar. God was sovereignly manipulating, I don't mean that word in a negative sense, but God was sovereignly orchestrating these events. And so when we say that the Lord was with Joseph, it means that God was active, an active presence and participant in Joseph's life, and it reinforces God's providence over Joseph's life. In other words, what does it mean? It means God is in control. God was in control of all of these circumstances, from his being sold into slavery to Potiphar being the one who purchased him in the first place. Joseph wasn't so successful in Potiphar's house just because of his sheer talent. It wasn't that Joseph was just so good at being a businessman or something like that. God was with him. I'm not trying to downplay Joseph's role in all this. God created him who he created him to be. But none of that would have mattered if God's hand of providence wasn't upon him, but we know that it was. So in what way was the Lord with Joseph specifically? We have presence, participation, providence, but let's get a little more specific in these vague terms. Specifically, how was God with Joseph? Well, we see these events unfolding, and we know that that's God's providence. But have you ever thought about the story of Joseph and how it's a little bit actually different from other stories in the Old Testament? How many great and mighty miracles do you see take place during the narrative of Joseph? Can you think of a single miracle that Joseph himself creates or participates in through the Lord working? Do we see any Red Seas parting or hailstones falling in the story of Joseph? Can you think of any? No, not really. And so, then how is God participating in Joseph's life? Well, it's not through great and mighty miracles like we see in so much of the rest of the Old Testament. What about visions and dreams? Does Joseph ever have any visions or dreams? Does God ever talk directly to Joseph? Now, this is a tricky one. This is kind of a trick question. Does Joseph ever have a dream or vision from the Lord that we know of? Or were those his dreams? They had the dream, right? He was the interpreter. So Joseph, as far as we know, we don't have any record of him receiving a great vision from the Lord, or now God had given him the gift of being able to interpret those dreams. But there's no record of how that took place. In fact, it all happens very quickly. If you read that in the text, it's not like the baker says, "Here's my dream," and Joseph says, "Well, let me go pray about it and talk to the Lord." And there's no record of God saying to Joseph what it means. It's just, here's the dream, and Joseph immediately has the interpretation. So we don't know exactly how that transpired. But we don't see Joseph receiving any visions from the Lord or direct word from God. In fact, Abraham, he received direct communication from God. Didn't he? Go to Ur, or leave here, go to this land that I told you to go to. Isaac, Jacob, his own father received direct communication from God, but we never see Joseph receiving direct verbal communication from God. So in what way was God actually present in Joseph's life? The unseen hand of guidance and sovereignty. In fact, it's much like how God interacts and guides us today. If you were to come to me and say, "I've received a vision from the Lord," I would say, "Well, you probably, shouldn't have eaten that hot dog right before bed." The Word of God doesn't give us that option anymore, I don't believe. That He's not communicating with us in that way anymore. Now, that wasn't the case in Joseph's day, but that was how God chose to interact with him, in an unseen hand of guidance, of providence over his life. Now, we actually have one step up on Joseph, because who do we have interacting with us on a daily basis? Holy Spirit, who indwells every believer in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so, Joseph's story, Joseph's narrative is somewhat unique in that it's not flashy. We don't see Red Seas parting or hailstones falling or giants tumbling. All of these things seem almost commonplace. Now, there's some great coincidences that you could say that take place, and his brothers showing up in these kinds of things. Obviously, the hand of God and his providence. But it's very, God's working very much behind the scenes as he does today, in a manner of speaking. And so Joseph, so to speak, reaches his peak of this section. Verse 3, his master sees that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him and made him overseer of his house, and all that he had was put into his hand. It came to pass that from the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house, that's Potiphar's house, for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. Have you ever noticed what the text actually says here? What was it that Potiphar noticed about Joseph? Did he look at Joseph and say, "Now here's a man that's intelligent and talented, I should put him in charge"? But what does the text actually say that was noticed about Joseph? Right, verse 3, right? And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord way all that he did to prosper. And so Potiphar noticed that there was something unique about this young man, Joseph. And it went beyond just sheer intelligence and skill. That there was deity involved here. Now, I have no idea in terms of Potiphar if he knew who Joseph's God was, or if it was just something else. But he certainly knew that there was something observably special about this individual that goes beyond human capability. What does that tell us about this individual? That Potiphar was very observant, and that he was probably a pretty good judge of character, which tells us that that's how he came to be the captain of Pharaoh's guard, which, by the way, is a very high position in Egypt. Joseph, in verse 4, becomes the overseer of everything regarding his household. And in verse 5, we see that the Lord actually blesses Potiphar's house because of Joseph. In fact, the text says, for Joseph's sake. This is a time of victory. This is a high point for Joseph in his life. I think this is the time when Joseph really becomes a man. He's probably, from the time that he sold into slavery through when he's kicked out of Potiphar's house, it's probably around a period of 13 years. I know that our little cartoon Sunday school things don't show the progression of his age usually very accurately, but he's probably in Potiphar's house around 13 years. And so he's in his late 20s and early 30s or something around that point. Depending on, we're not completely sure about that, but he's become a man at this point. And it's beginning to show in his character. It really does show in his character. In fact, the last thing that it says at the end of verse 6, Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. You know what that actually means? He was good looking. He was a nice looking young man. And which really may be what causes these next things to come to pass in many ways. And so he goes from this high point, a time of victory, to a time of temptation. Time of victory, and then he reaches the peak on the roller coaster. And what happens when you reach that peak? You start to go down again, don't you? It comes down the other side. And so that's his life. That's the way his life has gone to this point. And so he has reached the peak, and now it begins its descent again. And so in verse 7, we're introduced to his master's wife. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. You ever notice that Potiphar's wife is never actually, we don't even know her name. She's not called by her name at any point in Scripture. We don't know what brought her to this point, why she was so desperate for Joseph's attention, if Joseph was the only object of her affection or if there were many. We don't know what's going on in her life. We don't know why she was brought to this point. She's very direct in her request of Joseph. I find it interesting that this only seems to begin after Joseph's promotion. It doesn't seem like she paid much attention to him while he was a low man on the totem pole in Potiphar's household. And now that he's in charge of everything, all of a sudden she's giving him all this attention. But what's dramatically more important in this text than her temptation of Joseph is his response to it. His response, verses 8 and 9. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not that is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that is he hath in my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph's response is in two parts. First of all, he just flat out refused, right? Beginning of verse 8, but he refused. He didn't string her along. He didn't flirt with her at all. He just very direct as she was with the temptation, he was just as direct with his refusal. But he refused. And then he actually gives his reasons for his refusal. And it centers around two people. First of all, it centers around Potiphar. Why does he begin there? Well, probably because he's her husband. How could I do this to this man who has given me everything? Given me so much? All that he has is in my hands. The only thing he has kept back from me is you, because you're his wife. And so his reasons begin with a loyalty to her husband, Potiphar. But secondly, and more importantly, is Joseph's loyalty to God. He talks about Potiphar, but then he caps it off with what? At the end of verse 9. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Not Potiphar, God. And so as much as he appreciates all that his master has done for him and given it to his hand, he recognizes at the end of the day the sin is more against God than anyone else. And so what do we take note of here in terms of Joseph's character is that he has an extremely accurate view of sin. That yes, he would be doing great harm and offense to Potiphar if he did this thing, but ultimately all sin is against who? God. Every sin affronts is an affront to his holiness. And so Joseph's response is that he refuses, and he gives two reasons: loyalty to Potiphar, loyalty to God. She was, however, not so easily dissuaded. And I believe that she essentially lays a temptation trap for Joseph. As believers, we do our best to avoid places and times of temptation. But there are times when there is a temptation trap that we don't see coming when we step right into it without any intention on our part whatsoever. And that's what we see happens to Joseph. In verse 11 it says, that it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house in there with him. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled, and got him. And so she was lying in wait, waiting for that opportunity to catch Joseph unaware. She had her temptation trap set, and one day Joseph, just doing his job, goes into the house, and she's the only one in there. And the trap springs. But we know how Joseph responds. He flees. He just leaves her standing there. Leaves his coat behind him, in fact. He takes off so quickly. And so I want to look at Joseph's method for dealing with temptation. Joseph's method for dealing with temptation. First of all, it goes back to what we've already said, that he has an accurate view of sin. He understands what giving into the temptation will actually mean. An affront to the holiness of God. And so his accurate view of sin is what pushes him to, first of all, have a quick response when it comes to temptation. It really is vital that when we are confronted with temptation, that we respond quickly, as Joseph did, to turn and flee quickly. Why? Because the longer we sit and think about it, the easier it is to justify it. And we begin to think of the reasons why it's not so bad, or why it's not so wrong, or why it won't hurt anyone. Do not trust your own will to reason yourself out of sin. It doesn't work. We need to have Joseph's quick response to temptation. So he has an accurate view of sin, as should we. He has a quick response, and he does not listen. Thirdly, he does not listen to the voice of temptation. Look at verse 10. And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph, day by day, that he hearkened not unto her, to lie by her or to be with her. So even before she lays her temptation trap, day after day, she is hounding him. What does he do? He does not listen. He does not listen to the voice of temptation. He has an accurate view of sin first. Second, he has a quick reaction to temptation. Third, he does not listen to the voice of temptation. And fourth, he separates himself from the source of temptation. We actually see this in two ways. At the end of verse 10 it says that he hearkened not unto her, to lie by her, or to even be with her. He tried to organize his day so that he never found himself in a circumstance where it would just be her and him alone anywhere. But even when that happened accidentally, as you know, that can happen, he responded quickly. He doesn't listen, and he separates himself and flees. 2 Timothy 2:2 and 1 Corinthians 6:18 both speak about fleeing temptation. Fleeing temptation. We've got 10 minutes. We'll go to one. Let's go to 2 Timothy 2:2. You can follow along or just listen as I do. Maybe it's 1 Timothy. Well, I barely wrote that one down. That's what I get for adding a cross-reference late in the game. Anyways, 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. Notice what the word that Paul uses there. Flee. Run away. Separate yourself from it. And so Joseph's 4 steps, or 4-part method, whatever you want to call it, dealing with temptation. He has an accurate view of sin. He has a quick reaction. He doesn't listen to the voice of temptation. And he separates himself from the situation. And so, that time of victory, now he's going down the other side of the hill. And this begins that process of a downward trend in his life, at least from a human perspective. This leads us into the time of trial in Joseph's life, starting in verse 13. And it came to pass that she saw that he left his garment in her hand, was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled, and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her, until his Lord came. She spake unto him according to these words, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought up to us. Notice who she blames for this. The Hebrew servant which you brought. What does that remind you of anything? What does that sound like? Adam, doesn't it? The woman which you gave me, Lord. Anyway. Verse 18, it came to pass, I lifted up my voice and cried, and he left with his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master had heard these words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner thy servant did to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, where he was there in prison. And so he is firmly going down the other side of that hill now, isn't he? He is experiencing this time of trial. as we look at Joseph, and we also have been studying Job, what is the lesson that we've learned here? Doing what is right doesn't always lead to reward. Doing what is right doesn't always lead to reward. In fact, for Joseph here, it all hinges upon a false accusation that is leveled against him. It seems to be a recurring theme in Scripture in many ways. Joseph endures a false accusation. Job, how many false accusations did he endure? In Christ, our Lord and Savior. Much of his trial surrounds being falsely accused in so many ways. It's interesting in verse 20. Verse 19, excuse me. After this manner, at the end of the verse there, after this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. Who does it say that Potiphar was angry at? It actually doesn't. It just says that he was angry. I find that really fascinating. We don't know who Potiphar was angry with. Whether it was his wife or if it was Joseph. We don't know. It is fascinating to me that as opposed to executing Joseph, he just puts him in prison. We don't know what's going on there. But now Joseph goes from being firmly entrenched from a high point in his life, a time of victory, to, because of a time of temptation, is now experiencing a time of trial, and is now again at a low point, just as he was so many years before as he was sold into slavery. That time of trial, really all of this, the time of victory in Joseph's life, the time of temptation, the time of trial, all of this leads us to understand that what this really is it's all a part of God's in Joseph's life. But these aren't just seasons of life. These are God's hand of providence upon a person who is desperately trying to serve Him. And even before the chapter ends, we see the trajectory of Joseph's life begin to go up again. Because what does it say in verse 21? But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. Whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not into anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it prosper. So it seems like from the very moment that he reaches that low point again, in no time at all, he's starting back up the hill once more. Even as he sits in prison. The Lord was with Joseph. It's certainly accurate to say of Joseph's life that he was a man that experienced a lot of ups and a lot of downs. His life was a roller coaster. But the one thing that seems to be consistent in Joseph's life, the key phrase of this chapter is, the Lord was with him. And perhaps the most relatable thing about Joseph is that it wasn't through flashy miracles or big extreme examples of things going on in his life, but through that unseen hand of guidance in the life of Joseph, and ultimately in the life of you and me as well. Joseph experienced a lot of difficulty. I find it fascinating that he endures this period of false accusation from Potiphar's wife, as did our Lord, from those around him. One author pointed out that 2 times in Joseph's life, a coat gets him in trouble. He needs to learn to hang on to his coats a little bit better, apparently. first of the many colors and whatever one he was wearing that day in Potiphar's house. However, whenever Joseph went through the highs, the lows of years, we have no record of him shaking his fist at God. But what do we find him doing? We find him creating or finding a way to succeed in whatever circumstance God places him in. Even in an Egyptian prison. Because the Lord was with Joseph, the same God that guided, planned the life of Joseph, guides yours and mine. I hope that's an encouragement to you, and I hope that as we look at the life of Joseph, we see things there that apply to our hearts, to be more like him in some ways, but ultimately more like Christ. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for your word. We pray that it would guide us and direct us in all of our comings and goings, our thoughts and our words. Help us to seek you every day in a new and fresh way every day. In Jesus' sake we pray. Have a good night and God bless.